Every old building has its own geography of acceptable behavior. Areas where you walk fast, stairs you avoid, doors you never open. In 2019, a nurse working the night shift at a hospital in Boston encountered a spatial rule that defied basic architectural logic. The hospital administration enforced a strict policy regarding the building's fourth floor. After midnight, all operations ceased. No new admissions and no patient transfers. It was a total freeze on movement. This 3D cutaway shows how the building's layout isolated the floor. Lower levels stayed active, but the fourth floor was a deliberate dead zone. Within it sat room 417. Staff had one mandate: if it rings after midnight, do not answer it. Management had drawn a hard line between the logical operations of the hospital and this unacknowledged corner of the building. To a nurse on a busy shift, the rule sounded like a local urban legend. She viewed the instruction as a harmless superstition rather than a safety protocol. That skepticism lasted until 2:06 a.m. The physical barrier of the floor's policy was broken when the nurse's station phone rang, and the digital display identified the source: room 417. When she picked up, there was only silence and the sound of slow, wet breathing. Then a weak voice whispered through the receiver, pleading for help. Her choice to answer the call overrode the hospital's warning. By engaging with the person on the other end, she crossed the psychological boundary that kept the fourth floor contained. Lifting that receiver transformed the situation from an ignored rule into an active interaction. She had opened a line of communication with a space that was supposed to be empty. She left the safety of the station and walked into the hallway. Most of the lights were dead or flickering, leaving the corridor in a state of constant rhythmic shadow. She found the door to room 417 slightly ajar. Inside, a man was lying in the bed facing the wall. He was connected to an IV, but the heart monitor beside him was completely dark and unplugged. When she checked the patient chart outside the door, she found it was entirely blank. There was no name and no record of any admission for that night. As she stepped toward the bed, the room's television suddenly snapped on, filling the space with loud white static. She flinched, and when she looked back at the bed, it was empty. The man was gone, but the sheets were still warm to the touch. The heat in the bedding indicated that she hadn't imagined the encounter. Something with physical mass had been occupying that space only seconds before she turned. She fled back to the station. When she told a veteran nurse where she had been, her colleague grew pale and insisted she was mistaken. The colleague explained that room 417 didn't just have a no-admission policy. It had been permanently sealed and removed from service years ago. This 2D blueprint of the floor reveals the architectural reality of the building. It shows the sequential layout of the patient wards along the main corridor. The room numbers follow a standard sequence: 414, 415, 416. But then the hallway simply ends. There is a solid structural wall where room 417 should be. There was no physical square footage for another room. She hadn't just entered a restricted room. She had stepped into a space that didn't exist on the hospital's blueprints. Back at the station, the phone rang a second time. It was clear now that the source of the calls was not limited by the physical walls of the hallway. The second call broke the boundary between her work and her private life. The caller ID on the hospital phone didn't show another room. It showed her own home number. She heard her son crying on the line, followed by a deep voice that said, "Wrong family," before the connection cut to static. She abandoned her shift immediately. She drove through the empty city streets, focused entirely on reaching the safety of her house. The encounter had shifted locations. It was no longer tied to a void in a hospital hallway. It had followed her to the one place she felt secure. When she arrived, she found her husband and son asleep. The silence of the house offered a momentary sense of relief. By morning, she tried to rationalize the night. She attempted to convince herself that the stress of the shift and the lack of sleep had caused a series of vivid hallucinations. That rationalization ended when her son woke up. He didn't seem scared, but he was curious about the visitor from the night before. He asked why she hadn't helped the skinny man who was standing directly behind her while she was on the phone. When she picked up the phone at 2:06 a.m., she did more than acknowledge a legend. That single interaction turned a patient from a non-existent room into a permanent presence in her own home.